America first. And believe me, it's about time.
I'm dismayed at the US decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement. The UK has voted to leave the European Union.
This is the first time that this North Korean leader has launched a missile over Japan.
We don't have any chemical weapon.
I haven't seen even once any direct proof of Russian interference.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zainab Salbi, and I have the honestly extreme pleasure of being in conversation with two iconic women. One who is part of shaping the world of today, and one who has mastered the story of yesterday. With me is Canada's leading women diplomats, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. She comes from a strong history.
Jason, nice to see you.
A rich background in journalism, expert on Russia, and has led many, many international negotiations, including, you just came, what I understood, from Mexico City, where you were talking about NAFTA's ongoing negotiations. And we have with us the esteemed historian, Margaret MacMillan, who has authored several books on history of the world, and she writes it in such a way that it really helps those who are reading it, and I recommend everyone to read it, understand what's happening in today's world, actually. I mean, I think it's a brilliant way of how you bring it all together. Now, I want to start with Minister Freeland. It is just so exciting to be in Canada. It's like Canada is like a shining star in the world, and I'm not exaggerating in here. As a women's rights activist, I spent my life advocating for women, and now for the first time I hear a prime minister talking about what we would spend times in discussions with women's groups and all of these things. I hear that you rode bicycle in your way here, and you go in your bicycle to meetings. It's like just everything about Canada today. It's pretty cool. It's just refreshing. It's like a shining of hope in this world, in a world that is very scary these days. So I want to start with, you've said actually that Canada should play and can play a more influential role in this new changing world order. Well, what specific role do you think Canada can play?
Well, first of all, Zainab, thank you for saying such nice things about Canada. We love to hear it.
It's true.
And I want to start actually on a slightly more somber note, as the Prime Minister did, which is to express my very deep sympathy and Canada's sympathy for all the people in Florida and the Caribbean affected by the terrible hurricanes, and very specifically the Canadians who are still stranded there. This event is a brief window in my day, which is otherwise spent madly on the phone, working hard to get all those Canadians home. And of course, we're putting together a humanitarian assistance effort to help the people who live there. So Canada may be shining, but there are lots of Canadians who are really scared and frightened, and lots of parts of the world where things are difficult. Yeah. You know, on Canada's role, Margaret and I, who are old friends, were chatting a bit beforehand, and we were sort of saying, you know, we Canadians, we get a little bit uncomfortable when people say the kind of nice things you've just said about us, Zainab, right? Like, we don't shining star Canada, like, unless you're talking about hockey, we feel maybe that could be wrong. I think modesty is one of our national qualities, and you know, I think in the world today, a little bit of humility and modesty is probably a good virtue to have. I do think that this is a real moment for Canada and Canadians to be stepping up. I think that one of the ways that we do that is very much what the Prime Minister was saying. You know, the Prime Minister said there's nothing magical about Canada or Canadians, and I think we really know that. But, you know, in the world today, as you have just mentioned, Zainab, the whole idea of liberal democracy is not looking so robust. And I think it is really, really important that we work very hard here in Canada to make our liberal democracy, and I'm talking about a small L liberal, not a big red capital L liberal, small L liberal democracy as robust, as strong, as delivering for people as possible. And I think, you know, that demonstration effect is really, really powerful. I remember reading, it was maybe a year ago, in the British magazine Prospect, my friend David Goodhart, who was the founding editor of it, had a long essay about liberal democracy and immigration. And his sort of core thesis was you can't have a liberal society and be open to immigrants at the same time. And then in about the second paragraph, and I could be a little bit imprecise here because I'm just speaking from memory, he had a sentence in parentheses where he said, of course this is not true of Canada, but it's true of everywhere else. And so I think things like that, liberal democracy, the open society, it's so important that we work hard on getting those things right at home, and it is not easy, it's not elementary. You know, I like to say democracy grammatically is a noun, but we should treat it like a verb. We have to really, really work hard, and I think we're all trying. Yeah. On the international stage, you know, I think now is a moment, and I would be very interested in Margaret's views on this, not dissimilar to the period right after the Second World War. Right after the Second World War, you had really much of the world in rubble. And you had the world community, and Canadians played a very big part in this, certainly the Western Alliance coming together and saying, you know what, we've done a pretty poor job between the First World War and the Second. We're in a pretty sorry state. We have to build some kind of a rules-based international order. Canadians were very much a part of that. We were part of building the GATT and the WTO. We were part of building the Bretton Woods system. We were part of building the UN system. And I think that today, more so than at any other time since that post-World War II era, the rules-based international order is under threat. It's shattering. And a lot of people predicted that there would be some tensions around now. But we tended to think the challenges would come from the emerging markets. You know, they would come from rising Asia, maybe particularly rising China, looking for its place in the world order. And there are some tensions there. I mean, we've all know about the South China Seas. But the bigger tension, I think, to the surprise of very many of us, is coming from within the West, you know, the Western liberal democracies. And I think Canada has a very big role to play in sort of refashioning that post-World War II rules-based international order and making it fit for purpose for the 21st century.
Well, you know, I have to say, because, you know, my admiration for Canada is not only infatuation, but I am a Muslim, I'm an immigrant, I am from Iraq, and it's tough being all of that, and I'm a woman. I mean, there is that part, but, you know, but it's tough being a Muslim. This part is, my part of the world is producing a lot of refugees, and when I saw Canada welcoming refugees, for example, with a very emotional song that even just thinking about, you know, I have tears in my eyes. It's like it's a stepping back, it's stepping forward in a way that was so gracious for what I know is a very vulnerable population who are coming in here and who are asking for the world to help. You know, I want to, connecting it to refugees, I want to go back to Margaret for a second. We are still in the middle of a very, you know, of the refugee crisis in the world, you know, and crisis that has not seen since perhaps World War II. In your, what you have learned from history, what are the forces that will be released as a result of this crisis?
Well, sorry.
The forces that will be released as a result of the refugee crisis. What's the impact that
well,
you think from?
It can go two ways, can't it? I mean, it can do what's happened in Canada, where I think there has been a
at the grassroots and at the government level, an outpouring of sympathy and understanding for the people who are risking so much and who have lost so much. But there also can be a tendency, and I think we're seeing this in a number of countries, to want to shut the doors and say those people aren't like us, we're not responsible for them. And I think that is a very dangerous phenomenon. I mean, it's part of what the minister was talking about, that an order we took for granted, a liberal international order, is now under threat in many ways. And there are things now being said that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. People saying things about others, people making generalizations about others. And I mean, you as a Muslim must have seen this. I mean, people say things about Muslims which, if they were said about Jews or Gypsies or Ukrainians or Germans or Canadians, we'd all find appalling.
Absolutely.
But somehow it seems to be all right to say, Muslims this, Muslims that. And I think this danger, I think it's a natural human tendency. We tend to divide ourselves up into tribes or groups. And when times are troubled, you tend to want to close ranks, circle the wagons, whatever expression you want. But the danger is you also say that those people don't belong with us. They don't belong in this circle. They don't belong here. And I think a lot of the populism, both right and left, because I think populism is a phenomenon that crosses political borders, is being fueled by this perception that we don't like what's happening in our own societies. We're nervous, we're apprehensive, we've got to blame it on someone. And we don't like these others who don't sound like us, don't look like us, whose food doesn't taste like our food. So I think we see it play at the moment, two very, very strong tendencies. And I think it really will depend how we all deal with it. And I think it's very important to have leadership. I think we need political leaders who will not exacerbate the fear and hostility of others, but who will actually talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, recently we do have a good pushback against xenophobic nationalism in France. Angela Merkel hopefully will win. It looks like she's going to win. Do you think the center will hold in this moment in history?
I hope it will. All I can do is hope. I mean, historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future. We usually get it totally wrong. But, you know, I think people sometimes compare what's happening today to what was happening at the end of the 1920s and beginning of the 1930s in so many countries where the center didn't hold. But even then, there were centers that held, and we should remember that. It didn't hold in Germany. It did hold in France. It did hold in Britain. It did hold in Canada. It did hold in the United States. And so we have to remember that, you know, those who want to live in a stable and orderly society actually can work together. I mean, I think one of the things that has happened is we've forgotten, because we've had such a long period, certainly in the West, not other parts of the world, but certainly in the West, we've had this long period of peace and prosperity. And we've forgotten. I mean, the minister talked about how in 1945 the world was in a perilous state as a result of World War. And that gave real impetus to those who want to build an international order, build new institutions, avoid having a war like that again. But generations have gone by, and we've forgotten. And I think we've all become a bit complacent. You know, we assume that what exists today is always going to exist. We have to invest in it. We really do.
Yeah. Minister Freeland, you actually have written about that, about the impact of capitalism, 21st century capitalism on the people. And you have recently just came back from the discussion on NAFTA, the ongoing discussion of NAFTA. I want to show a tweet that President Trump has tweeted.
Thank you, Zainab. I'm grateful to you for that contribution to our conversation.
Where he said that Canada, well, I don't know if we're seeing the tweet yet, that we're, you know, that Canada and Mexico are being difficult. So I really want to ask, are Canada and Mexico being difficult? And if so, how?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Mexico, but I will say for Canadians and to Canadians that our position at the negotiating table is, I think, the way Canadians generally would like to behave. We have approached these negotiations with goodwill. We have done our homework. Every single text the Canadian side was supposed to deliver, we have delivered. I believe our professionals, I'm talking now about the public servants, our Canadian trade negotiators are the best trade negotiators in the world, bar none. And we had in Mexico City more than 85 people in the Canadian team, so we have a strong, smart group of people deployed. We're looking for compromise. We're looking for areas of agreement. We're always very polite. But at the end of the day, being polite does not mean that you can't be strong. And we are very clear in standing up for our national interest. And that is going to be how we continue to play this. Hockey is, after all, our national sport.
And it's also, furthermore, you introduce new ways for NAFTA or new resolutions for NAFTA that includes women's rights and indigenous people's rights. So it's not only preserving what's there, but also advocating for new components to catch up to our time today. What are your strategies to get that through? I mean, any leverage that you have for that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Look, we approach this negotiation. Our view about NAFTA is that it's been a very good deal. That it has been an agreement which has brought a lot of economic benefit to Canadians. Having said that, it's 23 years old, and every agreement can be updated. By our count, NAFTA has been significantly modified since its inception a dozen times. And so, we're rolling up our sleeves and looking to modernize it. For our government, modernizing all of our trade agreements means including progressive elements. As the Prime Minister just mentioned, for the first time in our modernized free trade agreement with Chile, this year we added a gender chapter, and we're saying to all of our partners, with other free trade agreements as well, we've said this to Israel, where we're modernizing our free trade agreement with Israel right now, that adding a gender chapter is a good idea. We would like to add an Indigenous chapter. As the Prime Minister said in the previous conversation, I think the Canadians in the audience will agree with me, our relationship with the Indigenous people in Canada, I think is probably Canada's original sin. This is something that we really need to get right, and it needs to be not just the job of the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. That's not just Carolyn and Jane. That's for the whole government to work on. So that is something we've put on the table too. And then labor and environmental rights labor and environmental chapters are now pretty standard in modern free trade agreements, and we're advocating for those as well. And what I will say, as the Prime Minister alluded to this, I am moderately optimistic on getting these progressive elements through. Ironically, we've had more raised eyebrows in Canada than we have had at the negotiating table. And, what I would say to Canadians is, come on, this is our negotiation too. Let's have the courage of our convictions, and let's put our agenda forward with goodwill, which is what we're doing.
Brilliant. Now, I want to take a second to talk about Russia. You are a Russia expert, and you are, I think, the only foreign minister who's banned from entering Russia.
I share that honor with Senator McCain, and also, as it happens, the leader of Canada's Conservative Party.
Okay. All right. There you go. What do you make of, how do you view President Putin's role in the new geopolitical order? Some, for example, are arguing that he helped Assad win the war, and that as a result, now it's becoming doubtful that UN Security Council Resolution 2254 be implemented in terms of changing political leadership in Syria. He's taking a more prominent role. How do you view that, and what's your read of that?
Look, I think what Russia has done in Syria in supporting the Assad regime means that, and I won't say Russia generally, I would say Vladimir Putin and his government definitely bears moral responsibility for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And that has been absolutely abhorrent, and we have to call them out on that. And that is something that Canada absolutely does.
Are you worried, though, about his increased role in a changing world?
The thing that I think we all, and there has been, I think, to the surprise of many, really great unity in the Western Alliance around this. The really big line that Putin's Russia crossed was the invasion and annexation of Crimea. And the continued war in the Donbass. And that goes back to our conversation about the post-World War II international order. Just, I think, a few days ago, I saw a quote from Angela Merkel, and this has been her position all along, that, the invasion and annexation of Ukrainian territory by Russia is such a big deal for all of us, because this is the first time borders in Europe have been attempted to be changed by force since the Second World War. Think about that for a minute. That is very, very serious and risks returning us to the horror of the pre-World War II Europe. And that is why our European allies are so united and so strong in saying this cannot be allowed to stand. And that's why Canada and the United States in our transatlantic alliance are saying, we absolutely support you there. So, I think it can sound terribly abstract to talk about this rules-based international order. And as Margaret said, we can get complacent because things are pretty good here in Canada, especially in September before the snow falls. It's all looking kind of great. But it's real. And having a rules-based international order for the West has meant that we have had more than 70 years without the terrible wars that were just par for the course before then. And now is really a moment when we have to stand firm. I was getting ready for this event. I brought 2 books because I think you should sell people's books. I brought Margaret's latest Histories People
we have your book
and
as well.
Zainab's Between Two Worlds. But I was looking at Margaret's The War That Ended Peace. And to me, it's pretty scary, the possible similarities, right? People on the eve of the First World War were kind of feeling like us, right? The Industrial Revolution had made people richer. Everything was kind of great. People thought that they had sort of, the Franco-Prussian War had been over for 30 years. People thought that they had reached this wonderful, endless prosperity equilibrium, and it didn't quite work out that way.
Well, let's talk about that, Margaret, actually.
Well, how long do you have?
Not long.
When I think an international, no international order is perfect, and we can see the injustices, and we can see what's wrong in our international order, but any order almost is better than none. Not any, but certainly, some sort of international order that works, where people do have to talk to each other, where they have to negotiate with each other, where we do agree on some rules, which is why the Putin taking of the Crimea was worrying, because we've had more or less an agreement since 1945 that you cannot conquer other people's territory.
In Europe.
But
in Europe, and even in the world, I think. Saddam Hussein tried it in the first Gulf War and was defeated.
That's right.
There have been attempts, but there have been very few borders have actually been changed by force since 1945. Very few. And
the other element I would add there, Zainab, if I may, that I think really we need to worry about at a sort of macro level is in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from the nuclear powers, including Russia. And those guarantees have proven to be hollow. Now, we are seeing today the great danger of countries feeling that their only security can lie in developing nuclear weapons. That creates a very, very dangerous world for all of us. And so I think we have to be really, really careful of that precedent.
Yeah. Well, the danger... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask you, because you have Brexit, and you have the withdrawal from the Paris Accord, and you have so many things happening, and in your own read of history, are we, like, you talk about brinks and moments in which we go to war, or moments that we pull back just on the edge. Where are we, in your opinion, these days?
The question I think we all have to deal with is how much more stress can the international system take before we do get people doing what the minister said, and that is saying we give up on rules and we're going to beef up our arms. And we all know that when you get into an arms race, it destabilizes the situation because someone's always behind. Someone's always ahead, someone's always behind. And the temptation is, if you feel you're falling behind, is to use your weapons while you still have an advantage. And that's one of the dangers. It makes, I think, the international situation very unstable. And I'm hoping that we've still got a China that, certainly with problems, but it's still invested in the international system. Putin, I think, still hasn't entirely given up on it. He will do what he can to cause mischief. I think he's an opportunist. He's playing a weak hand, actually. Russia is demographically in trouble. Its population is declining. It's got economic problems. It hasn't got a proper, real functioning economy. It hasn't got a rule of law. So he's I think, using his opportunities to make mischief.
Well, can I jump in, Zainab?
Absolutely.
So just to follow on from Margaret's point, something Canadians may not have sort of fully absorbed, our economy is bigger than Russia's. Yeah. Let's think about that for a minute, right? And like the world loves Canada, we're a shining star, we're fantastic, but the world doesn't exactly tremble at our economic might. I mean, our economy grew 4.5% in the second quarter. We're practically an emerging market now, but I told Bill Morneau that. He was very happy. But I just want to push back a little bit against the gloom. I used to be a journalist too, and I feel like there is maybe a journalistic tendency to see the glass sort of half empty. You know, the headline of "Everything Okay Today Again" is not a very good headline. But, you know, I do think the center maybe is holding more than people thought. And, you know, I see that not only here in Canada, but Zainab, you referred to the Paris Accord. Well, look, a lot of countries, in fact, all countries, with, you know, a couple of notable exceptions, are doubling down.
Notable exception.
But are doubling down on the Paris Accords, and I think that that has, you know, I think that there is a real coming together there.
And you think it is possible for the 194 countries that signed the Paris Accord to do it without the US?
As our Prime Minister said, we were very disappointed by the decision of the United States. We think that there are still a lot of environmental issues that we can work with the United States on. After all, we share a huge, huge border, both in the south and with Alaska. So there are a lot of environmental issues we have to work on together. And, you know, let's just keep on going. And on international trade, you know, it's possible to get really worried, but September 21st, CETA, our trade agreement with the European Union, comes into force. That's a really big deal. That is, in many ways, it's a deeper trade agreement than NAFTA, and it shows that the EU is able to act and that we're actually able to bring the world more closely together.
That's wonderful. Margaret, I want to ask you a question, because in your History's People, you talk about the role of people's personalities played, you know, prime ministers, kings, emperors, all of these things. Some historians call past wars a crisis of masculinity. But we are living in a world where we have, you know, many women in leadership positions, you know, one sitting right next to us, but also many women who are leading countries as well. Do you think that this may be helping in today's politics?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know. It depends on the person. I mean, you know, it used to be said that if only we had women in positions of power, we would have a much more peaceful world. And then we got Indira Gandhi in India, we got Mrs. Bandaranaike in Ceylon, you know, we got Golda Meir in Israel. I mean, these were women who were prepared to use violence and war if necessary. So I'm not sure that having women in positions of power, it depends on the women, doesn't it? I mean, I think what we need to do collectively, and I do think I was agreeing with, so we're being very boring and Canadian here, we're agreeing so much, but I do agree with them. But, you know, what I think is different about the world from, let's say, 1945 is we have far more international organizations. There's a whole skein, a whole network of international agreements. I mean, we know the big ones. We know the UN, we know NAFTA, we know about the World Trade Organization, but there are dozens and hundreds of international organizations and international agreements. And I think we have more depth in our international order, perhaps, than we had. And so I think, let us hope that that network is strong enough that if we get an individual in it, man or woman, who wants to try and break it up, we've still got enough countervailing force. And I do agree, we shouldn't be too pessimistic. I mean, I think we've moved a huge way since 1945, but we need to keep on building it. You know, we can't just say, we've got these lovely institutions, it's all done. Right. You know, you have to fix the roof every so often, you have to look at the basement every so often.
Yeah, it turns out it's not the end of history.
No, it is not. No, it is certainly not. We've got too much at the moment, I think. But
well, and to end actually on a gender note, now we are living in a I would like to. You're in a country where half of the cabinet are women. I actually agree with you that if you know that just if women lead, the world will be a better place. Not necessarily, but how about if women are half of the decision making? Are you seeing a different dynamic of the half in decision making and the dynamics and resource allocation, perhaps being in a cabinet that is at least equal?
So look, I, in general, very much agree with Margaret. I'm not one of these kinds of essentialist feminists who think that women are somehow more virtuous, more angelic, always want peace. I don't know, somehow we're mothers, will always do good things. I don't think that's true.
I agree.
And I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and like they all are both good and bad. Of course, they're only perfect, in case they're watching this. So I very much agree with that. Having said that, I'll tell you one story from our cabinet. At an early cabinet meeting, we, as Canadians will know, we have a lot of people relatively new to politics and new to being ministers. And then we have at the cabinet table some veterans. And so I think it was the Prime Minister asked the veteran ministers to talk about the dynamics in our cabinet compared to the dynamics in previous Liberal cabinets they had served in. And one of my colleagues said, well, you know, it's interesting. It's so different. Everyone in this cabinet really listens to everybody else. Everyone really tries to think about where they agree, where they disagree. They sort of try to understand why. And in the previous cabinet, we just fought, and like we really enjoyed fighting with each other, and we'd have different factions and tribes and stuff. And we thought it was really fun, and then afterwards we'd have a beer. And I happened to be sitting next to this colleague who said this, and he said, it was a man, of course, and he said, I wonder why it's so different this time. And I just looked at him, and I was like, really? You wonder why it's so different? So I think that is a difference, and I think probably having 50% women has contributed to that. I think our Prime Minister and the tone he sets contributes to that hugely too, but having 50% women, I think, does.
Yeah, well, and as he said, you get a different perspective. You know, if you are not representing 50% of your population, you're going to miss out on an awful lot.
No,
and I do, you know, I don't want to make a wild generalization, but I do think, in general, and there are always the exceptions, women probably have more emotional intelligence than men do. I think they have more empathy. They are perhaps more aware of different currents in the room. It's not to say there aren't men who can do it and there aren't women who lack emotional intelligence, but as a generalization, maybe there is a different style that women have.
Well, on this note, thank you so much. I actually left more optimistic than I started here.
Okay.
You know, we can do it. It's going to be okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you.